I'd love to do before we get started is if we could go down the panel and have the panel introduce themselves. I don't think we talked about that in our first meeting. So I'm gonna hand the mic off to Julie, and then we can just go down the line.
Great, thanks, Ann. And so, as Mike mentioned, my name is Julie Smith. I am with InterSystems, and I lead part of the product organization that really focuses on the provider and payer market. And I come from a long clinical background. I'm a nurse by training, and I've been in this field for decades. And so it's really exciting to see providers and payers come together in this way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Next on the Hollywood Squares is Stephan, I think.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Stephan. I'm a director of product management at Optum. I'm the guy who just talked at you for 20-something minutes.
And Danny Cawood here from MCG, Senior Product Manager, focused on a lot of what we do for prior auth and utilization management, automation, and interoperability. I'm semi-frequently the guy who will talk at you for 20 minutes, but happens to not be today. Lucky you all. Back to you, Anna.
Thanks so much. Is Joe here?
Yeah, so tonight in your program is the part of Joe Ellis will be played by Stephan Rubin, the guy who just talked at everyone for 20 minutes.
I missed that memo. Thank you so
Yes, no, the response to the inaugural performance was overwhelming, and so they decided to keep it going. So jokes aside, my colleague Joe had unfortunately a somewhat urgent conflict, so he asked if I could just kind of be here in his stead. So I'll offer a caveat to you, Anna, and my fellow panelists. My expertise is unsurprisingly more on the interop side than the AI side. Joe works on kind of a sister team to me, but him and I are in regular comms. We tackle a lot of the same problems. A lot of these things are universal. So I will contribute as ably as I can, but frankly, you all, I think, are probably a touch closer to the finer points here than I am.
Great. Thanks so much for jumping in. Really appreciate that, Stephan. And I think you're closer than you think you are, because data is the reason why AI.
Yeah, I'm learning that, aren't I? Yeah.
Yeah, you are. You're learning that. All of a sudden, we become very important.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I actually want to kick this conversation off around the foundation and what makes that AI turn into the right answer, the right insight at the right time, at the right place. So AI is only as strong as the language model that it is being run on top of. And so what does healthy data look like in the context of EPA? So we're speaking in regards to prior authorization and making that completely electronic today. Some argue that it is electronic. Portals are electronic. I'm like, no, nope, I beg to differ. So what is that? For the panel, what does that context look like for you? What does good, healthy foundation look like to you? So I'm going to start with Julie on this question.
Yeah, so this is really part of where InterSystems shines, right? It's part of our bread and butter. We've been at this a long time, and so I think our concept of healthy data is really thinking about the comprehensiveness of a record. One, saying not just is it accurate, but do we have a ton of duplication? Do we have a ton of things that need to be normalized? Do we need to harmonize that data? Have we actually traced it back for sourcing and things like that in ways that very often what we've done historically is just dump it into a giant bucket and not really taken a look at it to say, is it usable yet? And I think here's the opportunity to say, we actually have to make it clean. We have to make it usable, because otherwise, when we lay AI on top of it, it's not going to give us the answers we need, right? Because it's not working off a clean playing field. And when it's cluttered with the mess that data is in reality, we can't really move forward and have some confidence and assurance around the accuracy. And so healthy data is foundational. I've heard this, I do a lot of work on the AI space across some of our other industries that we covered. And it doesn't matter what industry it is. If we're talking about finance, if we're talking about healthcare, if we're talking about, space exploration, it all comes down to is the data right? If we don't start with good data, we can't actually make decisions that we need to make. That is absolutely true in the context of prior authorization.
Agree. Really important to get that foundation right. Anybody else, Daniel or Stephan, want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say for the other part of it, and it's maybe the uncomfortable part of it, is we know a lot of the data that's there is not clean and it's not right. Right. And so as we're thinking through from our perspective, sort of what we look at it, I agree with everything that Julie said, and I'll add on to it. It's, what Stephan was kind of talking about in his previous presentation of what is the right thing to do for the patient based off of evidence, and the historical data that's sitting there in that data lake is probably not the it's probably not the best thing, but I can almost guarantee you it's not the only thing that you should be looking at in terms of what should we do for the next patient coming down the line. I'm here in Orlando, actually, at Oracle's conference, and there was a patient story that they were talking about this morning during the keynote of all of the it was a mother actually talking about her son and all of the incorrect diagnoses that were sitting in various places of his medical chart at different provider groups in different EHR systems. And so even if we can get to a longitudinal health record for him, there's a lot of data in there that is deeply unhelpful and potentially misleading for thinking about the next patient with that set of considerations when we're doing. So it's taking a look at having a set of guardrails, regardless of the data that's in that lake and what's sort of been cleaned, and saying what's the right thing to do for this particular patient in this scenario. And to Stephan's point, I think where we both align is probably based off of some degree of medical evidence.
I think a corollary to what Danny said, which will be my 2-cent contribution to this, having seen versions of this problem in previous interop experiences, is having some context or perspective on provenance of data. If you're a payer and you're building a data asset, what are the various entry points into that data asset that your plan is using, right? What are you doing with your risk charts? What are you doing with, itemized bills that you get? And then sort of, I think, doing both a reconciliation, but then also doing some kind of honest accounting of like, we like a risk chart because it's comprehensive, but we like an itemized bill because it gives us the individual services, right? Sort of mapping the right data to the right use case and having a view into the entry points into your data warehouse as part of that.
Yeah, Danny, I might just add to that. I think it's a great call out because one of the things you sort of mentioned in that is both evidence-based practice, but really it gets back to how much of this really needs to be still structured and standardized. And I think sometimes what we hear or sort of assume is AI is going to mean we can only use unstructured data and we're going to be assured of its accuracy. And certainly there is no question that unstructured, being able to incorporate unstructured data is going to be incredibly valuable and open up use cases that we couldn't tackle before leveraging AI. But it does not negate the fact that, like to Danny's point, if you have incorrect diagnoses, the easiest way to clean those up is to actually have them codified. And having evidence-based practice actually matters in terms of framing it appropriately. That's particularly true, right, with EPA, what we're talking about now. But again, Anna, back to your foundation, this is all basics, right? You got to get the basics right to really make this meaningful.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch us mature through these two paradigms, one of which is we need to be 100% accurate because if you get this one thing wrong, a person's life is at stake, right? That's the stakes that we're dealing with here. So I would say that one paradigm is high stakes. We have to get it right. And then the second paradigm is that nothing is perfect, and not even brain science or neurosurgery is exact. You can ask them. They will say, it's not as exact as you think it is. So living in those two spaces in order to get to that foundation, we all have to work together to reduce the burden on and the timeline that it's going to take to get us to a place so that we can put all these agents on top of our language model that we have. And it is more fruitful than we think. We just got to really dig into working together and doing this as a village. And so as I think about the impact of what AI can bring to healthcare, its possibility. We got a long ways to go with the foundation, but we're going to do it, and we're doing it together. But at least I'm recruiting all of you on the panel and all 130 of you online. And we need. What do you guys think from a clinician's perspective as you're working with these clients? From my perspective, prior auth is really difficult. We navigate 18 different portals. We have to pull breast cancer results in a PDF attachment. There's not as much discrete data in healthcare as you think. How can AI move beyond how can it leapfrog over this problem for prior authorization? Let's say it's the perfect world and we've solved the foundation and now we want to leapfrog. I'm going to start with Danny on this one. Thoughts, Danny?
Yeah, I think, we've worked together in the past, and I think it's looking at and I know you're a human factors engineer by part of your background, right? And so it's true. Stephen and Stephan actually both said it in their presentations in terms of, are we actually going to get to true improvement of a workflow on the other end of this or not? And if we set out to check the regulatory box for CMS 0057 and don't move beyond that, I think the answer to that will very likely be no for a vast majority of health plans. And so the question becomes is, can we actually add value to that workflow downstream? And there's a wide variety of different ways to do that from my perspective, but you have to do something to make it easier, right? So Annie, you kind of kicked this question off in the last one by saying we have 7,000 different portals we have to log into, right?
Yes.
Think through the concept as a health, there's quite a few health plan folks I recognize on the other end of this. And I know that many of you delegate services like high-tech radiology to an Evacor, or you delegate behavioral health reviews to a Magellan. Another group of you have had various conversations about which services are going to be included in the first rollout of this prior authorization API. If this just becomes one other submission point instead of one submission point for everything, we're not going to get there as an industry. We're not going to actually get to making that downstream experience better. And so is it better to have, 130 procedures that are fully CQL? Everyone can shut their eyes really tight and book an appointment, and they're going to get an approval back in 25 seconds. Is it better to have 130 of those or take that same amount of money and do every single procedure that you might require authorization for inside of this? I mean, my perspective is the latter. I'm curious what the others think.
Hey, Stephan?
So I think that is such an interesting and important question, and I completely agree. Stephen, Stephan, Dana, we've talked about this before. Of we have to prove this can be successful, and it has to have impact because we don't need a 19th portal, right, or a 19th workflow. And a lot of this starts with the how is it done today? And we can all acknowledge it is incredibly complex. And the best way to tackle it, right? We've seen pilots have really, from a technology perspective, been sort of tried and true. They work, but it's been really challenging to move and assist payers and providers to move from pilot to full implementation because of that complexity, but because of choosing beyond that just sort of one thread to solve end to end. And I think that it's going to really take the entire community. I think back to, the high tech moving, I'm old enough to have documented on paper as a nurse and moving to electronic health records. And it was done sort of chunk by chunk, piece by piece for the most part, right? You did CPOE and then you did all these other things. And so we have to be thoughtful about how we approach it. And we have to make sure we are creating a path to success, because nobody wants to invest this much energy and time and just have something else that is also onerous. And so we need to have some significant early proof points and then expand. And I think there's a lot of value. Some of us have already had conversations around things like, finding out the most common challenging, pathways, the ways to demonstrate that success early. And I think, I know that this is really sort of throwing in the AI flavor to that. And I think that's where AI can be leveraged as a path to have that impact. AI is not a solution, right? AI is a how to help get to success.
I think that's right. I wrote down 3 things based on what you just said, Julie, of like ways that I think AI can kind of turbocharge prior auth modernization. The first thing I wrote down has nothing to do with prior auth, but it does have everything to do with kind of how to think about dividing work, which is vibe coding, which is essentially using large language models to generate blocks of source code. So if there are ways to take that paradigm and apply it to prior auth, I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to go too far out over my skis about like where that might be. But the idea of kind of taking large intractable problems with multiple dependent steps, breaking them into pieces, and turning an AI loose on just one part and say like, optimize this piece. And, the AI will probably, not get it right. Like some human will have to iterate over that. But the idea is if the robot kind of pushes you, like turbocharges that first 20% of the optimization or the improvement, then you saved yourself a ton of time. I think as a corollary to that, the second thing I wrote down is to accelerate experimentation. I feel like with prior auth, there's a real risk aversion and for good reason. But I think we're at a point now where the technology is so good that we can probably do some pilots and do some experiments and essentially say, okay, in any experiment we're going to design around an optimization or an improvement or a transformation of a part of prior auth, where can we use AI to accelerate that feedback loop? And then the third thing I wrote down is kind of keeping it to self-contained scenarios. So AIs work best when operating under like very clearly defined constraints, whether it's a clinical area, a care scenario, like a specialty, right? In the case of like Danny and Mai's product, right? Like individual policies, things like that, right? Just sort of saying, focus it on like just this thing. The more constraint you can give the AI, I think the less likely it is to get off track and misinterpret context or apply it incorrectly or, not interpret an abbreviation correctly, that sort of thing.
One thing I might just jump in with, because I know, Danny, we have talked about this, and Stephan, you're certainly aware. AI is a great opportunity also to do things that we don't do so well otherwise, right? I think that CQL is a great example of that, right? I mean, are you really going to get everything in CQL effectively? And I know, we've had some conversations in the past to say it's great for what it does, but this is an opportunity to get the edges complete and actually sort of have it be more end-to-end comprehensive.
That's great, Julie. I really appreciate the comment. First of all, you are the first one probably to say vibe coding on a weedy on a weedy.
I don't know if I should be proud of that or not, but
I think you should. I think you should, because this is the point. Be curious. This is not 100% accuracy rate. That's why I was bringing up the 2 paradigms, because healthcare needs to change its culture and being its mindset of being exact the first time and figuring out ways and places where you don't have to be exact and you can have a lot of controls to check to see, oh, why wasn't it? Let's make that, let's tweak it. Okay, better, the better this time, better next time. You'll get to 100% a lot faster. And I really appreciate the point that Danny was sharing around the latter. He was saying that let's codify all the things, make the bot specialized, like you were saying, Stephan. So it's something that we're going to have to shift our mindsets on. And our next question is more related to where in the space of AI or in the prior auth workflow. By the way, Julie mentioned a point of light, like let's do it. MultiCare has done it. It works. We've proven it works. So everybody needs to go out and start doing these experiments too. We're trying to recruit people to do it. And if you need help, let us know. We're here to share. We need more adopters in the world so that we can start making this right. Because if we do it as a village, we'll get to the 100% and we can live in both paradigms. So the next questions are on the details of the workflow and where we specifically think that AI has an opportunity to improve the workflow. I think, Stephan, you alluded to it being more specialized. So if you're going to put something into place, maybe around, excuse me, we started with one really hard auth, which was weight loss surgery, because there's so many variables to weight loss surgery. And maybe Danny, you can kind of speak to how that was a specialized intelligence run in order to get to approval or non-approval.
Yeah, I think that was where that approach that we took, I think we started with a hard one. The payers, Stephan talked in his previous session about numbers of indications and sub-items and what have you. I think that particular payer's medical policy at the time had over 80 individual indications inside of it. And at that time, the technology that was sort of available to all of us was CQL. And so looking at doing that type of informatics work at that type of scale for one policy, for one health plan, we did it, and it was expensive. And so, now I think we would go back and look at that opportunity as a better opportunity to say some of the, and even within that, out of 80 indications, I think we were maybe able to actually write CQL statements for a third to a half of them at max. And the reason being, and I'm not a clinician either, Julie's the only licensed clinician on the panel of the three of us at least. But I think looking at those, there's certain things in there that says an adult patient has a BMI of greater than this particular value. We can evaluate whether you're an adult, and that's date of birth. That's a very easy rule for us to do. We can look at, we can either look at a BMI that's already there, or we can do a very simple calculation, evaluation expression to get that value. And sometimes we have to do unit conversions within all of that, and that's all well and good. That's for one of those 80 things. You start going through and you say, okay, there's another couple of them that have to deal with your diagnoses. There's another couple of them that have to deal with some conditions that you may or may not have. Those are all CQLable statements. Then we get into the problematic ones where we said, you've already tried and failed less invasive treatment. Okay. There is a way to get at CQL for some part of that, but not all of it, right? We can start to lay out what is an example of better treatment or less invasive treatment. We can look for some of those procedures having been completed as part of your chart. Oh, by the way, if those were performed outside of that hospital system, now we have a question of whether that data is actually even going to be there. So there is that question that we have to sort of to work through, but we can write some of it, but we really can't fully probably get at that particular indication with CQL alone, because the element of failure of those treatments is very patient specific and context specific, and likely is buried, to Julie's point. That part of it is going to be buried in unstructured data that isn't always very easy to go through and restructure. And so those are some elements, going back now, I think we would have had much more of an AI first approach for that particular use case than we did at the time. And I think we got some good value even with what we did at the time. But I think now we would go back and say the ability for AI to be a more complete coverage of that particular policy than we were able to do with a more structured approach is probably what we would do now.
I love that example. It's so good. You can apply that in many places. Julie or Stephan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I love that, Danny, you said we would approach it a little bit differently now. I think that that's probably true for all of us as we've sort of gone on this journey together, that this is still rapidly changing and we can't ignore that fact. And every day we're getting better and better at getting faster, more accurate answers. And I think it's important to think about the electronic prior auth challenge as something that is still evolving, that we need those points of light, and we need to, as an industry, sort of say, this was our best understanding at the time, and the next round is going to get even better, and the next round is going to get even better. I think about this, it was not a focus on prior auth, but sort of a chart review use case that I was helping someone with around AI, where they said, one of the things that we've come to learn leveraging AI is we should always ask, what else do I need to know about this patient? Well, in that particular case, right, within the context of the question I was asking, it came up with, well, don't you know this is a veteran with burn pit exposure? Now, I'm never going to CQL that, ever, no matter what, right? And so I think that's just
policy. It's not in the policy. Yes.
Right. And so that's where you can have some aha moments of like, wow, this can blow this up and be beautiful. But that is one question, while we've also asked the necessary questions, right, around age or BMI or whatever those other things may be. But this is where AI shines to say, what else do I need to know? And you might have something that says, aha, that changes everything about this clinical picture, that absolutely is going to impact the prior authorization review and approval process. And so I think we're still learning and evolving, and there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Oh, and another example of a question that you're never going to ask via, or maybe you wouldn't even think to ask, Julie, right? You're a nurse. Going through these, looking at these things, we've gone through some cases where we said, yeah, the patient looks like they probably need to be at an inpatient level of care, looking at acute authorizations like Stephan was talking about, right? It looks like they need to be at an inpatient level of care. That's what they're ordered for. This whole thing looks good. Let's move forward. And that's a case, right, where we actually looked at the manual process that came before it. We run a lot of our test cases on things that we already know the answer to. And we verified the answer to. And so that one, we were like, that one looks like it should go ahead and approve. And then we get to looking and comparing it to the other one, and that was denied. And that was a case that actually got turned around by manual review in less than 15 seconds as a denial. And why? The patient discharged against medical advice before they made it to the floor. Another question that you're very rarely going to see in anybody's medical policy per se. Another question that you're probably not going to ask via CQL, actually, another question that's way more expensive to ask via CQL and via AI than just a traditional good old-fashioned rules engine that can take a very simple if-then statement and move on. But that's another example maybe of a question that you, Julie, as a nurse would be like, you look at that chart for 1 second, that first cover page, discharge date is today, and they want an inpatient level of stay that ends on Friday. What are we doing? No. So there's another and other examples of a question you might not think to ask. Sorry, Stephan, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I actually I had no notes. I really like what you just said. I think that the thing I'll just say to tie those two things together is just kind of transparently sharing those things when you find them and when you learn about them, and then just sort of asking the question of like, is this something that we think AI is even a good fit for? Or is this just it falls into that boundary of like, this is something we always want to have a human involved in, right? We always talk about the human in the loop dial at Optum of like, where does the human need to be in the loop, like intimately involved? Where can we really pull the human almost entirely out of the equation? And just sort of, setting that dial at the right level and acknowledging that the right level in one care setting is probably not going to be the right level in a different care setting.
Well, and I think I might just tag onto that. I think it's a great call out of transparency is really important. One of the things that we do some experimenting and testing, clinical validation testing on is the idea of, if we just go out to an LLM portal and ask a question, do we get a different answer or the same answer as when we've actually sort of added some intelligence, some guardrails, some processing, some other things, because frankly that answer is good enough in a lot of ways, but not for this use case. And so we need to make sure we're adding in the things that matter and then validating against the sort of the floor, and then what we would expect as Danny, I think you mentioned, you often match against what your manual process is today, right? So those outcomes. And so we're running it against multiple different metrics across the way. We're not just meeting what the existing metrics are, but we're exceeding them. And we're not just sort of wrapping and white labeling something, we're actually adding value there.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I mean, you moderate yourself. I don't know if I'm just kidding. You're so great. This is so great. There is a question in the chat that actually I'd love to answer now because it's related to what we're talking about here. And Hannah asks, will there be a need to have an opt-out process for some process requests that just can't be handled via API? And that speaks to the human factor part that we're talking about. Where does the AI sit? How do you make sure that the process we create for this future can satisfy 80% of the use cases, and then there's a exit button that says old process or maybe old new enhanced process. I don't know what it is, but what are your guys' thoughts around that?
So I'm happy to jump in here because clinically, of course, I have strong opinions. And when you look at the research around AI specifically, right, there's a lot of research around leveraging AI, particularly in radiology, right, and whether or not humans still need to be in the loop, because if they do something like read X-rays, their accuracy rate compared to residents may actually be better in some studies than the residents themselves, right? So there's a lot of academic research in the medical community around when you might be able to leverage AI that may or may not really require a human in the loop. And if you dive into those studies collectively and as a whole, categorically, even when an AI at initial first pass may get a more accurate reading, there's a need for potential review. And I think that EPA is a great example of something that you always have to be able to interrupt, right? Whether it's the AMA example that Danny mentioned or some other example, there are always things that might be missed that require that critical thinking and that need that validation and opportunity to revise. We at InterSystems have a policy of humans always have to be available in the loop. And so we provide opportunities for that tracking and interruption. And I think that I can't say what the industry will look like 20 years from now, but I think it's absolutely essential today.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add is I think that the straightforward answer to Hannah's question is probably yes. Will there be a need for an opt-out process? Yes, somehow, whether it's handled, to bring it back to Da Vinci, whether it's handled through CRD or whether it's handled through a brokered understanding between the provider and the payer. I think the two things you'll want to make sure you have in place as a corollary to that are, one, what are the conditions or circumstances under which an opt-out will happen, right? Is it initiated by the provider or the payer? And then sort of two, like have a really clearly well-defined path for, what is that experience going to be when an opt-out condition is triggered? If it's just going to be, and if you need to just shortcut right to, okay, it's two MDs need to get on the phone and just hash this out, right? Save yourself the time and just be like, we know this is where we're going to end up, right? Like let's just get here. And then maybe you do as part of a CPI thing, right? Continuous process improvement. Say, okay, well, we want to limit the amount of hours our MDs spend on the phone. Let's talk about macro, look at those rules, look at those processes. Can we change them? But, get to where you're gonna more than likely end up sooner rather than later.
For sure. And I think the last point from my perspective there would be very careful about what just can't means. If just can't is a clinical reason, like Stephan was talking about, I think that's fair. If just can't is we don't do home care authorizations via API because our source of truth system can't handle real-time access for length of stay considerations, I don't know if that's a good answer. The clinical one is a good answer. The we don't know how to do length of stay calculations is a bad answer from a what just can't means. And so I think there is an element of the more of those scenarios that as a health plan implementing a prior authorization API you introduce, the less and less valuable it's going to become from the downstream folks. And so if you can my old boss used to say, does it pass the red face test? If you can get up on a panel like this and say it's just can't and here's why, and you can explain why without your face turning red, I think that's a good just can't. If it's maybe we can't really explain that one that without turning face red, I think that's a scenario where you're going to start eroding the value that the implementation is providing. Then you're going to start eroding the adoption because you've started to erode the trust in sort of what you've built.
Exactly it. That's exactly it. I just put my favorite quote from HIMSS 2025 was new technology plus old organization equals costly old organization. Because if you can change the way you fundamentally work adopting EPA is changing your culture. It's a different way to think about the problem. And when we adopted it, we had different speed dial numbers that we called when the API wasn't available or the data was like we had different workflows than we did before. And so when we adopt something new like this, we have to really think about what's the culture it's going to take to get us there, because we will revert to what feels comfortable. That is what humans do. We also, group together. We like to be with people that make us feel comfortable. So ensuring that culture creates groups of people who feel comfortable with the technology is going to be really important in regards to what you're asking, Hannah. It's absolutely adoptable. It's just that just can't has to be weighted and have that curious mindset about why. My mother used to be like, if you ask me another why question, it's going to cost you $20. But in this world, I would say just keep asking that question all the time, all the time. All right, Stephan, anything else you want to add to the end of your question there?
No.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to the next genre of information, which we've talked about all the tech, all this AI, and part of the foundation we were discussing is really about standards. In fact, Julie mentioned structured and standard. I think all of you have mentioned something about a standard, but where do you think standards have to be, and how critical do you think they are for this to really bring us to scale? With the mindset that we're going, we're not striving for perfection here. We're agile thinking. I'll start with Stephan first on this one.
I have a lot of conflicting thoughts on standards because I think that they give us really great starting points, and much in the way like AI kind of serves as an accelerant. I think a standard can also serve as an accelerant, but anyone of a certain background will remember this XKCD comic, which I will try to find at some point and drop in the chat, where essentially two people are talking and they're like, we have too many competing standards and we need to come up with one unifying standard. And then jump cut to like, okay, well now there's 13 standards instead of 12, or there's 15 standards instead of 14. And so I think what you end up with in healthcare and interoperability is just as businesses and teams apply those standards to their local understanding of their product and their customers, right? And we're not immune from this, right? Like you diverge your implementation from the standard and now you've created de facto like another one. So I feel like the way to address that head on is to kind of advocate for, like, figure out if your deviation can defend itself, right? To Danny's red face test, right? Can this thing you want to do justify itself? And do you have to run out of breath to defend it? Or is it really just like it makes it easy for your business to achieve, milestone XYZ? And so it would really be great if the standard conveniently aligned with your priors. And then in scenarios where it can't, to the kind of broader conversations we're having about like transparency and trust, be like, well, why? Why do I think this divergence needs to exist? And does my business need to re-examine how we're structuring our information, how we structure our process, how we build our products, right? We are going through a version of this with InterQual where we're just sort of saying, look, there are ways in which our criteria structure diverges from the standard. There are ways where we'd like to see the standard change because we think that succinct, clear, unambiguous conveyance of evidence-based criteria is like vital. But then there's also ways where it's like, well, we've written this criteria this way for a long time. Do we need to re-examine how we write our criteria? Because this interoperable standard is where the industry is going. And we will not be able to just brute force push the industry one direction or another.
Great answer. Julie or Danny?
Yeah, I might jump in here too to say, we've been at the standards thing for a long time, and I think to Stephan's point, just adding another one doesn't help, but actually aligning and coalescing on a unified understanding is really, really helpful. And so, I have to say, I don't know if I will retire and or die before the last V2 HL7 message is sent, right? I mean, there's some of them that are really stuck, and there's some that sort of were created and died on the vine. And I think that, one of the helpful things is the fact that all of the new regulations and the new standards that are coming out for this type of work are all FHIR-based. And so then you can get to, okay, we're gonna define it the same way, we're gonna exchange it the same way. And the reality is to Stephan's point, a lot of it isn't formatted in FHIR today, but at least we have a goalpost now to aim towards, to work towards that alignment. AI can close many of those gaps. And so, I think that this is an opportunity to say standards have their place, formatting has its place. The way we interoperate is dependent on agreed upon understanding of the way to do so and expectations on both sides. But then we also have this opportunity to lay on top of it some added intelligence in a way that can actually bring us further.
Well said. No notes.
Julie, all of the vendors that do ADT notifications all just like felt their like jaws clench. And you were like,
Exactly.
they're like, I hope not anytime soon.
I hope not. It's going to be around for the next 100
notification.
years. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think as we think about standardization, the last point there is figuring out sort of where is standardization realistic and valuable, and where is it unrealistic and therefore more problematic in some cases than it is valuable. So I think, Stephanie, your presentation, you were talking about unifying and standardizing criteria if we can. We both probably align on a desire to have some element of that. And I think, from MCG's perspective, we come in eyes wide open that it is purely unrealistic in all cases, right? There's just certain states that say you just have to use this thing, and maybe we just wrote it and we're trying to get ROI on it, or maybe we wrote it 25 years ago, and it's just the way we do things either side of it. The other problem that we come at this with is looking at these standards even for burden reduction for CRD, DTR, and PAS. Sure, the way that maybe we talk between payers and providers can become standard, but we're not standardizing claims engines behind the scenes, right? We are not standardizing provider databases behind the scenes, network databases. We're not, and I'm saying we, not MCG, but as the industry, right? We are not even standardizing benefit plan definition behind the scenes, right? And so there is going to be some scenarios where we will need to, it's hard for the standards to be flexible, right? And so within the construct of the standards, they need to have enough inside of them where, and there are even some gaps I think we all acknowledge that need to be worked out with even what we have right now to make sure that more elements are available. But thinking through, is there enough there that we can sort of abstract out our own internal complexities after requests hit those APIs? Is there enough there that we can do what we need to do with them? Is going to be part of the challenge.
Yeah, if we think about the marketplace that is the United States, capitalism, variety means different cultures at each company, right? Different uniquely things that makes them marketable out there to choose from. I call this, in my world, this translates to cultural computing. Like, how can I get to 80% of a standard and then culturally take the rest of it so it makes them uniquely them and enable that? That's a new concept that I'm kind of noodling on, because when I go back and I talk to our engineers about implementing these standards, Danny, they're like, I can recycle 80% of the code consistently on these apps for APIs. And then there's the 10% that maybe AI can help me with. So it closes that gap. But there's still going to be 10% that a human in the loop has to do, because everybody culturally does it just slightly different. But that's what identifies them as an organization. And that is their, blood. It's their bloodline. So how do we create a standards environment that enables that capitalism in the marketplace, so that I, as a provider, can have many choices in the market to choose from? Okay, so we are getting close to time, and I would love to close with final words. Either what's your hope for the future, a piece of advice as we move forward with bringing EPA to life, and actually executing this. We've talked a lot about some of the details and the decision making that we've learned from over our experiences. So I'm going to go down the line here, start with Julie, then Danny, then Stephan, and then we'll close it out.
Thanks so much. So, it's been great being part of this panel, and certainly hearing Stephan earlier and then Stephan, and talking with all of you. I think that when I think about the next 6 months to 2 years of this space, I think one of the things I think about is really the quote you mentioned, Anna, of an old organization with new technology is just a costly old organization, that this is partially a technology problem, but this is largely an entire transformational engagement for everybody who's involved. And so when we think about doing this, we have to really approach it together. This is not something that anyone can do in isolation, and it really requires a perspective of partnership, whoever you're using, with vendors, with providers, with payers, in the work groups, all collaboratively, right? Talking about the transparency of our learnings along the way, because for this to be successful, we have to agree and have some common understanding and some common goals for clean data, for the workflows that are going to be involved, and for what success looks like. And then the only way we're truly going to get there is together, because this is not just technology. This is an all of us problem.
100% an all of us problem. And majority governance, data governance, culture. You got that right, Julie. All right, Danny, what are your thoughts?
I think hopes, I'll take the hopes for the future sort of side of it. I agree with what Julie said. I don't really have anything to add there, but from a hopes for the future perspective, I I hope this works. And I think the advice that I would have is get your hands dirty in terms of what the manual process looks like today. It is prior authorization more than any other thing that I've done, in my career in various different stops. There is so much complexity. The only thing that I can get even all people in a payer organization, but certainly people in a payer and a provider organization to ever agree on is it depends. It depends what. Document the hell out of it, understand sort of all of the different it's prior authorization has turned into a ball of yarn that's been battered around by a cat several different times. Um uh Several different cats in several different rooms several different times. And so the question becomes, can you successfully unravel what that ball of yarn looks like for at least your particular organization, so that you can actually make sure that all of this interoperability compliance stuff is actually working. Get your hands dirty with the way the manual process is done today.
Also highly recommend that. I had no idea that they were calling 6 people and waiting on hold for 9 minutes. Like I had no idea. You're like, what? You're suffering silently. Stop. All right, Stephan, bring us home.
I think the thought I would leave you all with, and Julie kind of touched upon this, but Annie, you've been circling it, and how you've been structuring these questions is that this process in the next few years is going to be as much about changes in culture and changes in attitude as it is about changes in technology and products and even workflows, because all those things are downstream of how our organizations make decisions and how we let go of the things that we're used to and that we're acclimated to, and take the risk of trying something new, knowing full well that sometimes when you try something new, it doesn't work. And the only way this is going to work, and I am here because I believe in the thing that Danny said, like I want this to work. I believe this has to work. And so the only way we all can make this work is if we let go of the side of the pool and take a swim and get our hands dirty to try to mix metaphors. So I think the thing I would leave the audience with is like, think about how you can get your organizations comfortable with change and comfortable with the fact that sometimes when you change things, they don't work, but that's not the end, it's the beginning. Create a sense of psychological safety, to borrow my IO psychology wife's favorite term. Help create a sense of psychological safety in your workplaces around like trying new stuff. Because it's the only way this is going to work.
Thank you so much.